My name is Nadia Osman. I'm 33 years old. 7 years ago, my mother signed her name to a document she didn't fully understand, and my aunt stood in that room and watched it happen and said nothing. Last April, that same aunt handed my mother an eviction notice for the house my mother had lived in for 31 years. 48 hours later, I drove to my grandmother's storage unit, opened a cedar chest that hadn't been touched since 2009, and found a document inside it that my aunt had told our entire family did not exist. 3 months after that, I sat across a conference table from my aunt and her attorney, and I placed that document between us. I didn't say a word. I watched her face go still. Before I tell you what was in that document, like and subscribe the channel and tell us in comments from where you are watching, and let me take you back to the beginning. Because you need to understand what this family looked like before it broke. You need to love what we had, so that you understand what was taken. Let's start at the beginning. The house on Clement Avenue in Minneapolis sat on the corner of a wide, tree-lined block, and for as long as I can remember, it smelled like cardamom and old wood, and the particular kind of clean that comes from a woman who takes pride in every surface she touches. My mother, Safia Osman, moved into that house in 1992. She was 22 years old, newly married, newly arrived from Mogadishu by way of a refugee processing center in Rome, and she had carried with her exactly one large suitcase, a small hand-embroidered pouch her own mother had pressed into her hands at the airport, and a quality that I have spent 33 years trying to correctly name. The closest I've come is this: she knew how to make a place feel chosen. She chose that house on Clement Avenue. She chose every room in it. My father, Hassan, had arrived 2 years before her through a church sponsorship program, and by the time my mother stepped off the bus from the airport and onto the cracked sidewalk outside the house that his sponsor family had helped him find, he had already hung curtains in the bedroom window. Yellow curtains, which my mother would later say were absolutely the wrong choice, and which she replaced within the week with a deep rust-red fabric she found at a Somali market on Franklin Avenue. But she kept the curtain rod, because he had put it up, and she appreciated the intention. This is the kind of person my mother is. She separates the gesture from the execution. She honors the first and gently corrects the second. I was born in that house, in the back bedroom, in February of 1991. Which means, technically, I existed in the house before my mother did, in the way that a letter exists before its envelope. My brother Yusuf came 3 years later, in the same room, in the same February cold, because my mother believed in consistency. We were not a wealthy family. My father drove a taxi for 11 years and then, when his knees made long shifts impossible, he managed dispatch for the same cab company for 8 more years, until it was bought out by a rideshare conglomerate that didn't need dispatch managers. My mother cleaned offices, commercial spaces, mostly, 4 mornings a week, and she kept an immaculate vegetable garden in the side yard that in good years produced more tomatoes than we could eat, and which she distributed, with the calm generosity of someone who has never considered not sharing, to neighbors up and down the block. I want you to picture the house correctly. It wasn't grand. 3 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with linoleum floors that my mother had covered with a large Somali-patterned rug, because the pattern underneath the linoleum was, in her words, an insult to the eyes. The front porch had 2 chairs that faced the street, and in the evenings my parents would sit in those chairs and drink tea and watch the neighborhood move through its evening rhythms. Kids on bikes, dogs being walked, the man 3 houses down who always seemed to be moving something in and out of his garage. I grew up watching them sit in those chairs, and I understood, in the wordless way that children understand the meaning of repeated rituals, that those chairs were the center of something. Not the house, not the block, something harder to name, a life that had been built carefully, piece by piece, from very little and which held. My father died in 2016. A stroke, quiet and fast, the kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you should have said. He was 61 years old. After his funeral, After the relatives left and the food was put away, and the house went quiet in that particular way that a house goes quiet when someone who lived in it is gone, my mother sat in her chair on the front porch in early November in Minnesota, which is not a month for sitting on porches, and she drank her tea and she looked at the street. I sat in my father's chair. We didn't say much, but before I left that night, she took my hand and she said, "This house is still ours." I know now what she meant by that. I didn't then. My father had one sibling, his older sister Farida. I want to be careful here, because I have spent a great deal of the last 3 years examining my memories of Farida for the signs I missed, and I have found some, but I have also found genuine warmth, genuine laughter, genuine affection. She was not a monster from the beginning. Or if she was the kind of monster who knows exactly how to look like someone's beloved aunt, and the performance was so complete that I cannot, even now, identify the precise moment when the warmth became strategic. Farida Osman, she kept the family name after her divorce in 2004, was 6 years older than my father. She was a tall woman, imposingly so, with excellent posture, and a habit of tilting her chin upward slightly when she spoke, which gave every conversation the faint quality of a formal audience. She had worked for many years as an administrator at a community college in St. Paul, which meant she was comfortable with paperwork, with institutional language, with the particular power that comes from knowing which forms to file and when. She visited regularly when we were children. Eid, of course, and the summer, and the occasional weekend, when she and my father would sit at the kitchen table for hours talking in a rapid, overlapping Somali that I couldn't quite follow, mixing in English words in ways that seemed to follow their own logic. She brought us gifts, not extravagant, but considered. She remembered what you'd mentioned wanting. She asked follow-up questions about things you'd told her 6 months earlier. My mother was cordial with her. Not cold, not warm. Cordial. My mother is a precise woman, and cordial was the word she chose for this particular relationship, and I understood even as a child that it had been chosen deliberately. Once, when I was about 12, I asked my mother why she and Farida weren't closer. My mother stirred her tea, she always stirs her tea, and she said, "Farida loves your father very much. In that love, there is not always room for the people he loves." 12-year-old me understood about a quarter of what that meant. 33-year-old me understands all of it. After my father died, something shifted. Not immediately, it was gradual, and it had the quality of a tide, which is to say you don't notice it happening until you look up, and the waterline is somewhere it wasn't before. Farida began coming around more. At first this seemed natural, even kind. She had lost her brother, my mother had lost her husband. Grief was a legitimate reason to want family close. She would come on Sunday afternoons and sit with my mother and drink tea and talk. Sometimes she brought her daughter Hadan, who was 27 then and worked in property management, a fact I filed away without understanding why it mattered. My mother, to her credit, opened the door to these visits without reservation. She is not a woman who assigns motives without evidence. She extends good faith the way some people extend credit freely, but she remembers the balance. There was one Sunday, maybe 8 months after my father's funeral, when I stopped by the house to drop off some plants I'd started for my mother's garden, and I found Farida sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of papers, and my mother looking at them with an expression I couldn't immediately interpret. When I came in, Farida closed the folder smoothly and said, "Nadia, come in, we were just talking about your father's affairs. All handled now." She said it pleasantly, conclusively, in the way you say something when you don't want questions. I should have asked a question. I didn't. The first time I noticed something genuinely wrong, I almost dismissed it. I am a landscape architect. I spend a great deal of my professional life reading spaces, understanding what they're telling you, what they're hiding, why a garden that looks healthy is actually stressed underneath. I notice things. I'm trained to notice things. And still, the first sign came and went before I caught it, because it presented as something small. It was 18 months after my father's death. I was visiting my mother on a Saturday in March, still cold, the yard still frozen, the tulip bulbs underground doing their patient work. We were in the kitchen. My mother was making kanjiro, which she does from memory, and which fills the house with a smell I associate with every good morning of my childhood. I mentioned, offhandedly, that I'd driven past a property on the north side that had come up for sale. A house with a large lot, a good yard, the kind of place I'd been keeping an eye on for investment. Someday, in the abstract way of 30-year-olds with ambitions that haven't yet been priced. My mother went very still. It was a fraction of a second. And then she was moving again, turning the kanjiro, and she said, "That area has been improving," and we moved on. But she'd gone still. I didn't ask. I made a note of it somewhere in the back of my mind, and I kept going, because we were talking about the garden, and then about Yusuf's new apartment, and then about nothing much. And it wasn't until I was driving home that the stillness came back to me and I thought, what was that? 3 weeks later, I was at the house helping my mother sort through some boxes in the basement, the long-deferred project of going through my father's things. We'd been at it for an hour, making careful separate piles. Keep, donate, family photos to scan. My mother was mostly quiet, handling each object with the particular attention she brings to things that have belonged to people she loves. We found a box of documents. Tax returns mostly going back to the 1990s, old utility bills, the title to a car my father had sold in 2001, and underneath these, a manila envelope unsealed with my father's handwriting on the outside, Property Clement Ave. My mother took the envelope from me, not urgently, gently with both hands. She set it on top of the box, not inside it. "I'll look at that later," she said. Later never came. When I helped her finish the basement 2 weeks after, the envelope was gone. I asked her about it directly. We were standing in the kitchen. I had learned from my mother that difficult things are easier to say in kitchens, in motion, while doing something else, and I said, "Mama, the envelope from the basement, the property documents. What happened to them?" She didn't stop what she was doing, which was washing a dish. She said, "Farida needed to see them, for the estate." "The estate was settled over a year ago," I said. She washed the dish. She said there was still something outstanding. "What was outstanding?" A pause, very slight. "I don't know the exact terms. She explained it to me. Something about how your father's name was on the deed, and there was a process to move it fully into mine." I stood there. I said, "Did you sign something?" She turned off the water. She dried her hands slowly on the dish towel. She turned and looked at me and she said, "Nadia, Farida is family. She has been handling things I don't understand. I trust her. This is what I want you to understand about my mother. She is not a naive woman. She is not uneducated or incapable. She speaks 3 languages. She raised 2 children on a complicated budget with grace and precision. She runs her household like a well-maintained garden, nothing unattended, nothing left to chance." But she had just lost her husband. She was 62 years old and she was alone in a house for the first time in her adult life, and someone she considered family was handling something complicated that involved paperwork she found opaque. And she had made a decision, the decision of someone who is tired and grieving, and not yet ready to suspect, to trust. I left the house that day feeling something I could not name. Not alarm, not yet. Something more like the feeling I get when I'm assessing a garden, and the soil pH is wrong. Not obviously wrong, not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough that the plants will struggle in ways that won't be visible until the damage is done. I started making notes. I don't know exactly when I began doing this, but sometime in that period I started keeping a small notebook, the kind architects use for field observations, in which I recorded in flat professional language what I noticed. Dates, specific words, what my mother said and what she didn't say. Farida's visits and their duration. Who else was present? What folders were visible? What was mentioned and then not mentioned again? It was not yet investigation. It was just paying attention, the way you do when you know something is wrong but don't yet know what. I told my brother Yusuf. He was living in Denver by then, which was part of the geography of the problem. He was 1,000 miles away and deeply occupied with a new marriage and a demanding job, and he received my concern the way kind, distracted people receive concerns that don't yet have a clear shape. He said, "Keep watching." And I knew he meant it, and I knew it would not result in action until the shape became visible. So I kept watching. The spring turned to summer. Farida visited on Sundays. Hadan, her daughter, began accompanying her more frequently. Hadan worked in property management and had the efficient, pleasant manner of someone who has spent years presenting difficult information in palatable formats. She was always helpful. She offered to drive my mother to appointments. She knew which city offices handled which things. She knew things about processes and procedures. In June, I arrived at the house one Sunday to find Hadan and my mother sitting at the kitchen table with a document in front of them. When I walked in, Hadan gathered the papers smoothly, not hastily, not suspiciously, just efficiently, and said, "We were just going over something for the utility accounts. Making sure everything's in order now that your father's name needs to be updated." "Utility accounts," I said. "Yes," Hadan said, pleasantly. "It's one of those little administrative things, annoying but necessary." She smiled, I smiled back. In my notebook that evening I wrote, June 14. Hadan plus Safia, kitchen, unsigned or just signed document. Utility accounts explanation. Does not feel like utility accounts. My grandmother, my father's mother, died in 2009. Her name was Fajumo, and she had come to Minneapolis in 1995 and lived with Farida in St. Paul until her death. She was 81. She was a tiny, formidable woman who wore her age in her face without apology, and who had an opinion about everything and a silence about a few very specific things that told you more than the opinions. When she died, her possessions were divided. Most of her things went to Farida as the eldest child. My father received a few items, photographs, a small decorative plate, and a cedar chest that had been hers since before she left Somalia. The cedar chest smelled like the inside of an old promise. My father stored it in a rented storage unit on the south side where he kept, over the years, a bicycle he intended to fix, winter tires, a collection of Somali cassette tapes, and the general accumulation of a life that runs out of room. When my father died, no one touched the storage unit right away. It's one of those things. The bills were on auto pay, my father, to his credit, organized his practical affairs carefully, and there was no urgency, and we were all moving through grief at our own speeds, and the unit simply continued, locked and dusty, and holding its contents intact. I remembered it in the fall of 2023, 7 years after my father's death, and approximately 18 months into my growing unease about Farida and the documents, and the things my mother had signed that she did not fully understand. I remembered it because I had, by this point, begun to think seriously about what I was trying to find and where it might exist. Here's what I knew. My parents had purchased the house on Clement Avenue together in 1992, a joint purchase, both names on the deed. When my father died, his share should have passed to my mother through standard inheritance, and if the estate had been handled properly, the deed should have been updated to reflect her sole ownership. Farida had told my mother this process was in progress and required some documentation. My mother had signed things. I did not know what. What I suspected, in the flat, careful language of my notebook, was this. Farida had used the period immediately following my father's death, while my mother was grieving and disoriented, and not yet ready to scrutinize anything closely, to insert herself into a legal process and obtain a signature or series of signatures that had changed the status of the house in a way that would benefit Farida or her daughter Hadan. I did not know how. I did not know exactly what. But the outline of it was there. What I needed was documentation. Specifically, I needed anything predating 2016, my father's death, that established the original ownership and intent of the property. The storage unit was where I started. I went alone on a Saturday morning in October. I brought my notebook and a flashlight and 3 empty banker's boxes for sorting. The storage unit was exactly as chaotic as a storage unit tends to be when someone has been adding to it for 23 years without subtracting. I spent 4 hours in there. I found the bicycle, the winter tires, the Somali cassette tapes. I found boxes of my father's papers from his taxi driving days. I found my mother's old sewing patterns, folded neatly in a plastic bag. I found my brother Yusuf's kindergarten drawings, because my father was the kind of man who kept kindergarten drawings in a storage unit for 3 decades. And in the back corner, on a wooden shelf, I found the cedar chest. It was exactly as I remembered: dark reddish-brown wood, tarnished metal hardware, the faint smell of cedar and something older. The latch was unlocked. I sat down on an overturned plastic bin, and I opened it. Inside were my grandmother's things: a folded prayer rug, pale green, a stack of photographs, loose, a leather-bound Quran with her name written inside the front cover in her handwriting, a small bundle of letters in Somali, tied with a ribbon that had dried to stiffness, and underneath everything, pressed flat against the bottom of the chest, a large envelope, government issue, the kind that comes from official processes, sealed, addressed to my grandmother, Fajumo Osman, at an address in St. Paul. Postmarked 2006. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I was expecting them to shake. I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages. The first was a letter, a cover letter from a Minneapolis area property attorney named Gerald Voss, addressed to my grandmother, referencing a previous conversation and confirming the enclosed document as discussed. The letter was dated March 14, 2006. The second page was a legal document. I am not an attorney, and I want to be careful not to pretend that I understood it completely in that moment, sitting on an overturned bin in a storage unit in South Minneapolis. But I understood enough. It was a property trust instrument, a document establishing a revocable trust for the house on Clement Avenue. The trust named my grandmother, Fajumo Osman, as the grantor. It named my father, Hassan Osman, as the primary trustee. And it named, as the beneficiary upon my father's death, my mother, Safia Osman, as sole inheritor of the property, not to be divided, not subject to further estate proceedings, not transferable by any means other than my mother's own voluntary action. The trust instrument bore my grandmother's signature. It bore my father's signature. It bore the signature of Gerald Voss, attorney, and it bore a notarization stamp. The third page was a brief handwritten note, in my grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it from the Quran in Somali. I photographed it immediately. I would have it translated that afternoon. The translation read, "Hassan, I am putting this here because I do not trust paper that lives in one place. When I am gone, Farida will want to be in charge of things. This document means she cannot be. Show it to Safia when she needs it. She will know when. Mama." I sat in that storage unit for a long time. My grandmother had known. She had known her daughter. She had known the kind of woman Farida was, or the kind she might become in the presence of property and grief and an opportunity. She had prepared for it. She had done it quietly 7 years before her son would die, and she had hidden the document not in a lawyer's office or a bank vault but in a cedar chest that smelled like home, because she knew, somehow, that the chest would survive and that someone who loved the family would eventually look inside it. She had been waiting for me. I drove directly from the storage unit to a copy shop and made 3 copies of every page. I put 1 copy in my bag. I put 1 copy in a fireproof envelope that I mailed to Yusuf that same day. I put the originals back in the envelope and drove to my own apartment and locked them in my desk drawer. Then I called a property attorney. Before I tell you what happened with the attorney, I need to tell you what happened in the weeks before I found that cedar chest. Because what Farida did in that time is essential to understanding the full picture, and I won't skip it. In September, 6 weeks before I found the chest, my mother called me. She sounded calm. My mother always sounds calm. but I had been listening to her voice my entire life, and I knew the specific quality of the calm she was producing that evening, which was the calm of someone holding something down. Farida came today, she said. Yes, I said. She brought papers, a pause. She said there is a complication with the property. She said that because of how your father's name was on the deed, the way it was structured, there is a question about whether I actually own the house. She said she has been working with a property person to sort it out. She said, another pause, shorter. She said it may need to go through a different process. A formal one. I sat very still. What kind of formal process? She didn't explain exactly. She said it would be better handled by the family, since bringing in outside people makes it complicated and slow. Mama, I kept my voice even. Did she ask you to sign something today? A silence. Not today, my mother said finally. She said the paperwork would be ready next month. You haven't signed anything in the last few weeks. Nothing new. The utility names, she said. Just the utilities, and something for the property tax filing. I closed my eyes. I need to see those documents. Nadia, her voice shifted, not defensive, something more complex than that. Something that said, I know what you're thinking and I need you to understand that I cannot live in suspicion of the people who are left. Farida is Hassan's sister. She is the last person I have who knew him before he was mine. I understood that. I genuinely did. And it almost broke me open, because the thing Farida was exploiting was not my mother's naivety, it was her love. Her grief. The desperate and entirely human need to hold on to the people who hold the memory of the person you've lost. I said, I know, Mama. I know she loved him. I just want to see the documents. She said she would look for them. She called me back 3 days later and said she couldn't find them. I drove to the house. We looked together. The filing cabinet where my mother keeps important papers, organized, labeled, as meticulous as everything she does, contained her medical records, her immigration documents, her lease receipts from the 1990s, Yusuf's and my birth certificates, and my father's death certificate. It did not contain any property documents, not the original deed, not the mortgage history, not anything Farida had given her to sign. My mother sat at the kitchen table. I sat across from her. For a long moment neither of us spoke. She took them, I said quietly. I said it plainly because someone needed to say it. My mother said, she said she needed to keep the originals for the process. I said, and you let her take the originals. A pause, long enough that I understood my mother was hearing the sentence differently than she had heard it when it was happening. Yes, she said. I reached across the table and I held her hand. I said, Mama, I need you to stop speaking to her about the property until I figure something out. If she calls, if she comes, you can see her, but don't sign anything. Don't give her anything. Can you do that? She looked at me. She said, do you know what you're looking for? Not yet, I said, but I think I know where to look. 2 weeks later, I went to the storage unit. But in those 2 weeks, I tried everything else first. I called the county recorder's office and asked for a copy of the deed on the Clement Avenue property. The clerk told me the most recent filing on the property was from 18 months earlier, which was exactly 18 months after my father's death. The deed had been updated. She read me the name on the updated ownership record. Farida Osman. My mother's name was not on it. I drove to the county offices and paid for a copy of the filing. The document had my mother's signature on it. The document said, in language that required 2 readings to fully parse, that Safia Osman was relinquishing her interest in the property at Clement Avenue to Farida Osman for purposes of trust administration, pending resolution of the decedent's estate. My mother had signed away the house. She had believed she was signing something to finalize the estate. She had signed a quitclaim deed. I stood outside the county office in the October cold, and I called Yusuf and I told him what I'd found. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." I said, "I need a good attorney, and I need to find what Grandma left behind." Catherine Haverson had lived next door to my parents on Clement Avenue since 1996. She was 71 years old, a retired postal worker with an impeccable memory, and an 8-year-old rescue greyhound named Leopold who she walked twice daily. And she had been, in the slow accumulating way of long-term neighbors, one of the most consistent witnesses to my parents' life in that house. I knocked on her door on a Tuesday evening in early November, 3 weeks after finding the cedar chest. My attorney, a woman named Andrea Coates, property and estate law, St. Paul, had told me that witness testimony about the nature of the property relationship and my mother's regular occupation of the home would be useful context, though not central. The central document was the trust instrument, but context mattered. Mrs. Haverson opened the door, saw me, and said, "Nadia, is it about your mother?" Which told me she already knew something was wrong. "Can I come in?" I said. She made tea. Leopold regarded me from across the room with the ancient calm of a dog who has seen most things. I explained in general terms what had happened. The quitclaim deed. Farida. The process of signatures my mother had been moved through while grieving, without understanding what she was signing. I told Mrs. Haverson I was working with an attorney and that I might need her to speak to that attorney or, possibly, in a more formal setting. Mrs. Haverson listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, she set down her tea, folded her hands on the table and said, "I'm going to tell you something I should have told you sooner, and I'm sorry I didn't." She told me about the Sunday afternoon, approximately 14 months earlier, when she had been deadheading her front garden which faces the street, facing the Osman property diagonally, and she had seen Farida and Hadan arrive at the house. She had not thought much of it. Farida's visits were regular. But this visit was different. It was longer than usual. And at one point, Mrs. Haverson, gathering her tools to go inside, had passed close enough to the open front window to hear a portion of the conversation happening inside. She had heard Farida say, clearly and deliberately, "Safia, your name is not on the new deed. We had to remove it temporarily because of Hassan's estate, but it will come back to you. You are still the one who lives here. Nothing changes for you." She had heard my mother say, "When will it come back?" She had heard Farida say, "Soon, don't worry about the timeline, worry about the garden." Mrs. Haverson looked at me. She said, "I didn't know what a quitclaim deed was. I didn't know what I'd heard was important. I thought it was administrative. I thought your aunt was being helpful." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't quite. She said, "Your mother brought me tomatoes from that garden for 26 years. She brought them in a paper bag, every August without fail. I should have asked more questions." I said, "You're asking them now." She said, "I'll talk to your attorney." She did. She gave a detailed written statement. She gave a recorded account of what she had heard through the window. She described her 26 years of observation of my mother as the primary occupant and caretaker of the Clement Avenue property. She described the social presentation of the household, the garden, the chairs, the rhythms, in language that a person who had lived next door for 27 years could only produce through genuine knowledge. She was, as Andrea Coates later told me, the kind of witness that attorneys pray for, old enough to have memory, precise enough to be credible, close enough to the facts to be relevant, and without any personal stake in the outcome except the truth. Leopold came and put his head in my lap when I was leaving. I held it there for a moment. "Good dog," I said. "He knows," Mrs. Haverson said. 2 weeks before our filing date, before anything formal happened, before Farida knew what was coming, I spent an afternoon with my mother. I want to tell you about it, not because it's relevant to the legal story, but because it is the truest part of this story, and I think it's the part that will stay with me when everything else fades. It was a Saturday. Cold but clear, the kind of Minneapolis November day that apologizes for itself with good light. I came at noon. My mother had made hilib ari, goat stew, which she saves for occasions she considers significant, and when I asked what the occasion was, she said, "You are coming. That is the occasion." We ate together at the kitchen table, the one where so many hard conversations had happened and so many ordinary ones. She told me about the garden, what she was planning for spring, which seedlings she was thinking about starting indoors, whether she thought the corner bed needed to be rebuilt. She talked about the garden the way she always has, as a project that assumes a future. That assumes that she will still be there in spring, and in the spring after, and in the one after that. I let her talk, I asked questions. I looked at her hands on the table, the particular shape of them, which are my hands. After lunch, I helped her with the dishes, and then we sat in the living room, and she put on a Somali singer she loves whose name I can't spell but whose voice sounds like my childhood, and we just sat. Not talking much. Just in the house. In the particular quality of afternoon light that comes through the west window in November and makes the room feel like the inside of something amber. At some point my mother said, without looking at me, "You found something." I said, "Yes." "Something good." "Yes, Mama." She nodded, just once, and she said, "Your grandmother was a careful woman." I looked at her. "You knew about the chest." She was quiet for a moment. I knew she had done something. Hassan told me a long time ago. He said his mother had made arrangements. He said if anything ever happened, I should look in the cedar chest. She paused. After he died, I looked. I couldn't find it. I didn't know it was in the storage unit. I thought she must have. She didn't finish the sentence. "Why didn't you tell me to look for it?" Another pause. "I didn't want to believe I needed it," she said quietly. "And then, I did need it. And by then, I didn't know how to ask you to go looking for something that might tell us our family had broken." I crossed the room and sat beside her. I put my arm around her. She is a small woman, my mother. She feels larger than she is. She always has. She said, "What happens now?" I told her, in plain language, as clearly as I could. I told her about Andrea Coates and the trust instrument and the plan. I told her what we were going to file, and what we were going to argue, and what we expected Farida to do when she received the notice. My mother listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Will it work?" I said, "I think so. The document is clear. Andrea is good. The law in Minnesota on property trusts is clear." She nodded, then she said something I want to remember exactly. "I am not angry with Farida. I want you to know that. I am sad for her. She must have needed something very badly to do this. To use Hassan's death this way. That kind of need, whatever made that in her, that is its own punishment." I thought about this for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor. The singer's voice filled the room. We didn't leave those chairs until it was almost dark. When Andrea Coates sent the formal notice to Farida Osman's attorney, she told me to expect one of three responses: immediate capitulation, aggressive pushback, or silence followed by maneuvering. She had been doing property law for 19 years and she had, she said, seen all three, and she had a strategy for each. What she did not fully anticipate was that Farida would come to my mother's house. I know this because my mother called me 12 minutes after the call from Andrea's office, telling me the notice had been sent, which means Farida had a contact inside the process, or had been monitoring for legal filings on the property, which Hadden, working in property management, would have known how to set up. My mother's voice was the careful calm. "Farida is here. She is very upset. She would like to talk to you." "Don't sign anything," I said. I was already getting my keys. "Don't engage about the property. I'm on my way." I drove to Clement Avenue and arrived to find Farida sitting in the living room in a posture I had never seen her take before, rigid. Her chin not tilted upward but forward, the posture not of a woman holding an audience, but of a woman who has lost the high ground and knows it. Hadden was not there. I sat down across from Farida. My mother was in the kitchen. I had asked her on the phone to stay there. Farida looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Where did you find it?" Which confirmed, in case I'd needed confirmation, that she had known about the trust instrument. She had known it existed. She had simply calculated that it was lost. "In Grandma's cedar chest," I said. Something moved across her face. It was complex, several things at once, none of them simple. Something that might, in a different situation, have looked like grief. "She told you," she said. "She left a note." Farida looked at her hands. She said, "Your grandmother never trusted me." "She trusted you enough to leave a note, explaining why she'd made the arrangement." A silence. "Farida," I said, and I worked to keep my voice neutral, because I am my mother's daughter and I had learned from watching her that there is a way to say hard things without cruelty. "I need to understand. Not for the case, for myself. Was it because of Hadden, the property management work? Were you trying to set her up with the asset?" A long pause, long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. "Hadden works in property management," she said finally. "She has built contacts. She has the knowledge. I thought after Hassan died, with your mother alone, the house is a liability. She can't maintain it. The property taxes, the upkeep. I thought someone who understood these things should be involved in managing it. I thought I was protecting it. By transferring ownership to yourself." "Temporarily," she said. And I heard in that word all the self-justification that had been building for years, the story she had told herself about why this was not what it looked like. I thought of my mother's words in the amber afternoon light. She must have needed something very badly, and I sat with that for a moment. "Farida," I said, "the house belongs to my mother. It has always belonged to my mother. Your own mother made sure of it before she died. That's over, but I want you to know something." I waited until she looked at me. "My mother doesn't want a war. She's not trying to expose you publicly. She wants her house back and she wants this to end. What happens next depends on whether you can let that happen cleanly." Another silence. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means your attorney and my attorney can work this out without a trial. It means the trust instrument is filed and on record, and the property reverts to my mother without a fight. It means you and Hadden step back. Completely." She sat very still, then she said, "And Safia? My mother will decide what she wants her relationship with you to be. That's between them." Farida stood up. She was not crying, which surprised me. She looked like someone who had arrived at a place they had been walking toward for a long time and recognized it as the consequence of their own steps. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. She said, "Your grandmother's note. What else did it say?" I thought about lying. I decided not to. "She said you loved your brother very much. She said she hoped you would find a way to be good to the people he left behind." Farida left. I went into the kitchen. My mother was standing at the sink. She was not making tea. She was just standing. I stood next to her. We looked out the kitchen window at the frozen garden. "It's over," she said. "Almost," I said, "but mostly over." She nodded. She turned on the water. She washed the one cup that was in the sink. "I want to back up here and tell you about Andrea Coates, because she deserves more than a mention." Andrea was 44 years old, a St. Paul attorney who had spent the first half of her career in corporate real estate, and the second half doing exactly this kind of work. Property rights, estate disputes, the legal untangling of things that families do to each other in the aftermath of loss. She was compact and precise, and she had the quality that I look for in professionals the way I look for it in healthy root systems. She was thorough below the surface. I had found her through my network, a landscape architect colleague whose family had used her in a similar situation 5 years earlier. I called her in October, the week after I found the cedar chest, and she agreed to meet me at her office on a Thursday evening. I brought everything: the trust instrument originals in the fireproof envelope, my notebook, the county recorder copy of the quitclaim deed, a timeline I had written out in chronological order, the photograph of my grandmother's handwritten note, plus the translation. Andrea looked at all of it without speaking for about 20 minutes. Then she looked up and said, "The trust instrument is valid." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Gerald Voss is a legitimate attorney. I've looked him up, he retired in 2018, but he's reachable. The trust is properly executed, properly notarized. It predates your father's death by a decade. It establishes clear beneficiary rights for your mother. The quitclaim deed that was obtained afterward is, to use the most conservative language I can, legally ineffective against this document. Because you cannot transfer property out of a valid trust through a document signed by the beneficiary without the beneficiary's informed consent and the involvement of the trustee or trustee's successor." She paused. "The fact that your aunt is an intelligent woman who understood property processes makes this worse for her, not better. She knew, or should have known, that the trust existed. She may have known and obtained the quitclaim anyway. If the latter is true, we are looking at fraud." I said, "My mother doesn't want to pursue criminal exposure." Andrea nodded. "Then we pursue civil recovery. We file to invalidate the quitclaim and restore the property to your mother under the trust terms. We can also file a lease pendens on the property immediately, which effectively freezes any transfer or action Farida could take while the case is pending. The trust instrument is our foundation. Mrs. Havorson's testimony and your notebook add context. The county records are damning on their own." She closed the folder. "What I'm telling you," she said, "is that your grandmother won this case before she died. We're just going to court to say so." I called Yusuf that night. He was on the first flight to Minneapolis the following week. He stayed for 3 weeks. He sat in the second chair at my mother's kitchen table, and we worked through everything together, the timeline, the documents, the strategy. He was the one who called Gerald Voss, the retired attorney who had drafted the trust, who agreed to provide a declaration confirming the instrument's execution and intent. He was the one who organized the filing logistics, while I worked with Andrea on the substance. It matters that I tell you my brother was there. He was 1,000 miles away for most of this, which I have sometimes resented, and when it counted he came. That's what I need to say about Yusuf. Farida, to her credit and also to my surprise, did not fight as hard as I expected. Her attorney, a property litigator named Michael Strand, who I later learned had a reputation for aggressive tactics, filed an initial response that challenged the trust instrument on technical grounds. Specifically, that it had never been properly recorded with the county, and that as an unrecorded instrument, it could not supersede a recorded deed. Andrea had anticipated this. She explained it to me with the patience of someone who has delivered this explanation before. Recording requirements for revocable trusts in Minnesota are different from recording requirements for deeds. A trust is a private document. It does not need to be recorded to be valid. It needs to be properly executed, which this is, and it needs to be in effect at the time of the action it governs, which it is. Strand knows this. He's filing the challenge because he's required to try something. She filed our response within 10 days. There was a deposition. I want to tell you about the deposition because it was one of the strangest 3 hours of my life. Hawden was deposed first, separately, before our filing. Andrea obtained the transcript through discovery. I read it at 11 o'clock at night in my apartment. Hawden's answers were careful and consistent and precisely shaped to suggest innocence through omission. She had assisted her mother with administrative matters she had not fully understood. She had not reviewed the documents personally. She had not known the details of the trust instrument's existence. That last claim was, in my assessment, false, but proving it was difficult, and Andrea advised me that we did not need to prove it. The trust instrument invalidated the quitclaim regardless of Hawden's knowledge or intent. She was not the owner of record. We needed to establish that Farida's ownership was invalid. We did not need to establish criminal intent. My mother was deposed on a Thursday in January. She wore her good coat. She sat very straight. She answered every question with the precision of someone who has been meticulous her entire life, and who has nothing to hide, and who is fully aware that honesty is her strongest position. She was asked whether she understood what she had signed at the time of signing. She said she had not fully understood, and had relied on family explanation. She was asked whether she had been told the document would affect her right to remain in the property. She said she had been told her name would be temporarily removed for administrative purposes and would be restored. She was asked whether she had been told Farida would become the property's legal owner. She said she had not. She was asked once, by Strand, in a tone that I can only describe as probing for weakness. "Mrs. Osman, you lived in this home for over 30 years. You had a close relationship with Farida Osman for many years. Is it possible you simply misunderstood what was being explained to you?" My mother looked at him. She said, "I understood what I was told. I did not know that what I was told was not true." The deposition ended. Strand and Farida's team made 2 more motions. Andrea responded to each. There was a mediation session in February that lasted 6 hours, and which I attended with Andrea, and which Farida attended with Strand, and which ended at 4 in the afternoon, with an agreed framework that Strand and Andrea then spent 3 weeks converting into a formal agreement. The near-quit moment, and there was one, because there always is, came in the middle of that waiting period. 3 weeks of silence after 6 hours of hard conversation, and during those 3 weeks, I got a call from Strand's office informing me that their client was reconsidering the agreed framework and might require additional time to evaluate options. I called Andrea. She said, "This is a negotiating tactic. She's trying to reopen the framework in a weaker moment. Here's what you're going to do: nothing. You're going to wait. Because the trust instrument hasn't changed and the county records haven't changed and her position hasn't changed. She's bluffing." I waited. Strand called back 4 days later. Their client was prepared to proceed with the agreed framework. The agreement, it did not go to a judge in the end. It was a negotiated settlement with a court-approved consent order, did 4 things. First, the quitclaim deed was voided. Fully, on record with the county effective immediately. The document my mother had signed under false pretense, believing she was signing administrative paperwork, was declared invalid. Second, the property at Clement Avenue was formally transferred to my mother, Safia Osman, as sole owner, in accordance with the terms of the trust instrument my grandmother had executed in 2006. The trust itself was dissolved upon transfer, its purpose having been fulfilled. Third, Farida Osman agreed, as a condition of the negotiated resolution, to make no further claims on the Clement Avenue property and to have no further involvement in my mother's property affairs. This was not punitive. My mother had asked for the minimum necessary. It was functional. It was a boundary with legal weight. Fourth, the legal costs of the proceeding were split, which was a concession on both sides and which meant my mother did not bear the full expense alone. Yusuf and I had covered most of it, but the split was symbolic, an acknowledgement that the proceeding had been necessary because of something Farida had done, not something my mother had asked for. On the day the consent order was filed, Andrea sent me a text. It said, "Done. Check the county records tomorrow morning." I was at work. I was in the middle of a design review for a public park project I'd been developing for 6 months. I excused myself from the meeting, walked to the bathroom, stood at the sink, and was very briefly not entirely all right. Then I washed my hands and went back to the meeting. I called my mother from the car on the way home. She picked up immediately. I said, "It's done, Mama, the house is yours." She said, "It was always mine." Yes, I said, "Yes, it was." She said, "Come for dinner Friday, I'll make kanjiro." What happened to Farida? She did not lose her job. She did not go to prison. We did not pursue criminal proceedings, as my mother had requested. She did not, as far as I know, face any formal professional consequences. What she lost was harder to quantify. Hawden, her daughter, found a different position at a property firm in Milwaukee and moved there in the summer. I don't know whether that move was directly connected to the proceedings. I only know it happened. My mother did not pursue reconciliation. She did not pursue rupture either. She did something more precisely calibrated. She sent Farida a letter, handwritten in Somali. I don't know exactly what it said. My mother has not told me the full contents, and I have not pushed. What she told me was this. I told her that I knew she loved Hassan, and that I hoped she could live in a way that honored him. That is a sentence of my mother's that I will carry for the rest of my life. Farida never replied. I don't think my mother expected her to. The house on Clement Avenue is, at the time I'm recording this, fully in my mother's name. She has repainted the front door, a decision she made the following spring just because she felt like it. She chose a deep teal. It looks exactly right. The garden is excellent this year. The tomatoes are abundant. Mrs. Haverson received a paper bag of tomatoes in August, as she has every August for 26 years. Leopold got one, which greyhounds should probably not eat, but which Leopold appeared to enjoy. Gerald Voss, the retired attorney who drafted the trust, sent a card when it was over. It said simply, "Your grandmother would be glad." I kept the card. My grandmother's cedar chest now lives in my mother's bedroom, in the corner by the window. My mother has put a few things in it, photographs, some fabric, the small hand-embroidered pouch she carried from Mogadishu in 1992. She treats it carefully. She knows what it held. Here is what I think about when I think about this story, now that enough time has passed for it to be a story rather than a crisis. I think about my grandmother, 81 years old, in St. Paul, arranging for an attorney she had located herself, signing a document she understood precisely, and hiding it where she believed the right person would someday look. She was preparing for something she hoped would never happen. She was a woman who had survived things that made her good at preparing for the worst. She was also, I think, someone who understood that love and trust are not the same as naivety. That loving your family does not require you to leave them unprotected. That you can build a firewall around the people you love without ever telling them what you've done, because the telling would require explaining what you're afraid of, and some truths are best kept until they become necessary. I think she understood Farida in ways I don't fully understand yet. Not because Farida is a simple character. She isn't, but because my grandmother had a lifetime of watching the people she loved, and she had seen what grief and proximity to property can do to a person who was always, just slightly, on the outside of something she wanted to be inside of. I think about my mother, who extended good faith until she couldn't, and who, when she found out what had been done, did not collapse or rage or become someone I didn't recognize. She remained herself. She was hurt, and she was steady, and she fought in the only way she knows how to fight, which is carefully and without theater. I think about the house on Clement Avenue, which has stood on that corner since before my parents arrived, and which has held my family's life. The children, the garden, the chairs on the porch, the smell of cardamom for 31 years. I think about what it means for a place to belong to someone. It is not about a document in the end, though the document was essential. It is about the 31 years of a woman's daily life lived in a space. The plants she grew, the door she repainted, the rugs she chose, the voices that filled the rooms. That is the real record of ownership. The document just catches up to what was always true. There is a magnolia tree in the side yard that my mother planted the spring after my father died. She said she wanted something that would outlive her. It's 6 years old now, and this past April, it bloomed for the first time, white flowers, brief and enormous, the kind of thing that takes years to arrive and lasts only a week. She called me when it happened. Her voice had something in it I hadn't heard in a long time, the quality of someone who has arrived somewhere they'd been working toward. "Come see it while it's still here," she said. I drove over that afternoon. We stood in the yard. We looked at the tree. The flowers were exactly as she'd described. I thought of my grandmother's note. She will know when. We stayed until the light changed. If you've stayed with me this long, I want to say something directly. What happened to my mother happens. It happens in forms large and small, in families of every background, to people who are grieving and trusting and occupied with the enormous work of surviving loss. The mechanisms are different, different documents, different relationships, different timelines, but the shape is familiar. Someone in a vulnerable moment, someone in a position of proximity, and a choice made in the dark. If you're in a situation where something feels wrong, where documents are appearing that you don't fully understand, where someone is managing things that should be yours to manage, where explanations come without evidence, please talk to an attorney. Not eventually, not when you're sure. Now, a consultation costs less than you think. The question, is this normal, deserves a professional answer. My grandmother knew this. She knew it so well that she acted 17 years before it was necessary. I want to be the person who passes that knowledge on to you. If this story touched something in your own experience, I want to hear it. The comments are open. I read them, every single one. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. New stories come every week. Stories about belonging, about betrayal, about the people who fight back, and the things that make it possible. The house on Clement Avenue has a teal front door now. It is, by any legal and human measure, exactly where it should be. So is my mother. So after all of this, am I.